I have been assigned the responsibility of talking a little bit about our mid-17th century history. Time permitting, I want to do so in three parts. I want to talk about origins in England, especially in London. Then I want to read to you a very interesting description of the origins of one of the churches in its own words. And then thirdly, if time permits, I want to cross the Atlantic and talk about Baptist origins in the 1640s here in the colonies. So that's where I hope to go. I hope it all comes together. To be honest with you, at about 4 o'clock this morning, as I couldn't sleep and was thinking about this, I decided to go in this direction. So it's not exactly what I had prepared, but I hope that it will be cohesive and encouraging to you. I have to begin by repeating some of the things that Dr. Van Dixhoorn said last night. He presented well to us and helped us to understand some important things. I just want to reiterate what he said and begin by talking about the religious climate in England. As he mentioned, the Puritan movement existed within the Church of England since the Reformation era, but there were many struggles during the 16th century, especially during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. She died, and James I came to the throne. He was James VI of Scotland. And by the time that James came to the throne in 1603, you could say that there was a predestinarian consensus in the church. That is, the hierarchy and most of the ministers of the church, in one way or another, were committed to the doctrines of grace, as we would call them. Now, that doesn't mean that they were necessarily completely committed to all of the things that we would be committed to, because there were great differences between the Puritans and the hierarchy of the church. But still, there was this kind of predestinarian consensus. As Dr. Van Dixhoorn mentioned, as James was coming from Scotland down to London, he was greeted with the millenary petition, the request of about 1,000 signatories that further reformation be made in the Church of England. And he agreed that he would meet with them. And so a conference was scheduled at Hampton Court Palace, which is on the Thames, south of London. If you ever get a chance to go to London, it's high on my list of places to see. I really enjoy being there. James, of course, had been raised in Presbyterian Scotland, and we heard last night that he was not much of a friend of the Presbyterians in the Kirk. And when he came to England, he eagerly advocated the Episcopalian system. He's famous for a remark that he made. It's a twist on an ancient saying of Cyprian, one of the church fathers. Cyprian said, "No bishop, no church." Well, King James said, "No bishop, no king." And the idea was, in his mind, was that he could control the land by means of controlling the church. Now, think about it like this. There were probably about 10,000 parish churches scattered throughout England at that time. And you were required by law to attend the parish church week after week. Of course, if you were ill or there were other reasons, you might be absent. But typically in a parish church, attendance would be taken, so they would know where you were and what you were doing. And he recognized that the church was a means by which he could have some direct control over the church. They didn't have any other means of communication but the fact that the whole nation, at least theoretically, met together every Lord's Day. So he recognized the usefulness of the church and continued to press his program in that way. He died in 1625, and his son Charles I succeeded him to the throne, and things changed even more drastically. Dr. Van Dixhoorn mentioned that James had been looking for a wife for his son, and of the princesses of Europe, he finally found one. Her name was Henrietta Maria. She was a Roman Catholic. And so she was welcomed into England, and there was a priest that accompanied her. There was Roman Catholic worship that was going on, and many Christians were concerned about the fact that Rome had been given an inlet back into the nation. Well, one of the acts that James took was to promote to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury, the top dog ecclesiastical position in England, a man named William Laud, L-A-U-D. Now, all of you Latin scholars will recognize the fact that Laud spells praise in Latin. We sing it in some of our hymns. All glory, laud, and honor to the Redeemer King, L-A-U-D, all glory, praise, and honor. So his name is, in a sense, William Praise. Now, he was apparently a little man, very short, and so he was nicknamed Wee Willie. But there's an even better one. The Puritans really hated him because of what he was doing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But some wise guy, put together a little ditty, and it went like this: give great praise to the Lord and little laud to the devil. That's a good one, isn't it? Now, why did they think about this? Well, there were many factors involved. Let me talk about two major theological positions that Laud was committed to. This is not the whole program, but these are two things. First, there's what I have called aggressive Arminianism. William, if you've ever seen the 39 Articles of the Church of England, you have to acknowledge the fact that they are predestinarian, they're Calvinistic in the way that they're phrased. But Archbishop Laud made it illegal to interpret them in a predestinarian sense. He wasn't a postmodernist, but it certainly was a postmodern approach to the interpretation of the 39 Articles to make them say what they didn't say. At the same time, the second plank in his program is what I've called high church sacerdotalism. And that's the remnants of the Roman Catholic Mass, and especially for our purposes, infant baptism. It's hard to distinguish Laud's view of baptism from that of Rome, because infant baptism was the first step in the work of grace, entrance into the church, and it led to salvation. And Laud sought to enforce these positions on the Church of England and on Christians in England. And in the 1630s, his campaign of persecutions was based on these positions, and it drove Puritans to New England, some of them to Holland, but many of them to New England. This is the time when the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Connecticut began to grow in population. But this also affected a group of separatists who were meeting in London. And so I want to talk about this church, the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church, as it's called, sometimes just simply the JLJ Church, from the initials of the three surnames of its three pastors. In 1616, an important early Puritan, Henry Jacob was his name, formed a new illegal church in London. Now, it was a separatist church, but in the literature, regularly it's called a semi-separatist church. And I'll tell you why. It was independent, that is, it rejected the hierarchical structure of the Church of England. It wasn't subject to the bishops and the bishops' rule. But a difficult question that faced separatists at this day was how to baptize children. Now, that doesn't seem like it would automatically be a difficulty. But your baptism and the record of your infant baptism in the parish manuscript book was the legal means by which you could establish who you were in terms of ownership and parental relationships and all the rest. It was your birth certificate. And it was the responsibility of the parish ministers or the clerks of the parishes to record the infant baptisms that were done. Now, when Henry Jacob formed his church, this immediately presented a problem for the people. But Jacob was of mind to say, there are good men in the Church of England, and so we can take our babies down to the local parish and have them baptized by the parish minister and recorded, making them legal. Now, one of the interesting facts about the Jacob Church at this point was there were some well-to-do, what we might call middle-class people in the church. And of course, their money and their property for the next generation required a legal registration of their children. If they didn't have them baptized legally and have them recorded, they might be in jeopardy of being able to inherit from their parents. And so for the first years of the existence of the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church, the parents would bring their babies to the local parish church, and the babies would be baptized, and all was well. And because they did this, in many ways, the authorities looked the other way, didn't press down upon the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church as they did some other separatist churches in London. But this church becomes the seedbed for particular Baptists in England. By particular Baptists, I mean Baptists committed to Calvinism, to the doctrines of grace as we know them. Now, this church continued to exist. In 1625, Jacob emigrated to Virginia, and a new pastor was called. His name is John Lethrop. He was the second one. In 1633, a division took place in this church, and now the division was, were baptisms performed by Church of England clergy legal? Could we continue to take our children down to the parish church? Now, 1633 is an important date because that's when William Laud comes to power. Remember what I said about his two planks, a high church sacramentalism and aggressive Arminianism, his attempt to turn the Church of England in a new direction. And so these people who are already sympathetic to separatism are unwilling now to take their babies down to the parish church in order for them to be baptized. And so a separation comes, and those who have the stronger views, who say, no, we can't do this, and we're willing to subject ourselves and our children to some form of jeopardy, we'll start a new church. So in 1633, there's another church that has begun. It's still a church based upon the principle of infant baptism, but it's in reaction to what Laud is doing and the prevailing climate that he's trying to bring to the Church of England. In 1638, 5 years later, a second division comes in the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church. By this time, Lethrop is gone. Henry Jesse has been called to be the pastor. John Lethrop emigrates to Plymouth in the Plymouth colony near Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the first two pastors emigrate to America. In 1638, when Henry Jesse is the third pastor, a second division comes, and now it's over the subjects of baptism. Now, it seems to me that it's important to remember what's going on in the Church of England and the pressure that's coming from Archbishop Laud through the bishops on the parish ministers, aggressive Arminianism and high church sacramentalism. And the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church has already struggled with the question of baptism. Now, along comes another group within the church, and they question whether or not infants should be baptized at all. See, the first time the question was, can we bring our children down to the parish church? This time, should we bring our children anywhere to be baptized? What does the New Testament teach us about the doctrine of baptism? And so the split takes place. Now, it's not the typical kind of split that we would know. It's a split that was congenial to some degree, where the tender consciences of John Spilsbury, who was the leader, and those who were following him were acknowledged and recognized within the church. Now, I'm not saying that everything was beautiful in the way that the separation took place, but it wasn't a hard separation like we might know today. They respected their views. And this is the appearance of the first Calvinistic Baptist church in England in the 17th century. Now, a couple of things need to be said. Number one, they're not practicing immersion. You might be surprised by that. But immersion has not come up yet. This is a question of the subjects of baptism, not the mode of baptism. How did they baptize? Well, probably they did so by taking a cloth that was wet and washing the face with it. It may be that they poured water over someone's head, or it may be that they sprinkled them, but they weren't immersing yet. But nevertheless, they formed this church in 1638 over the principle of believers' baptism. They were separatists who adhered to Calvinism in the face of persecution by aggressive Arminians, and they were living in a church that was struggling with the reality of the pressures of high church sacramentalism in the Church of England in general. And so I have wondered if these issues abroad in the larger church are causing theological ferment in the church, the Jacob Lethrop Jesse Church, and leading them to the conclusion that they draw in 1638. Well, the next step, of course, is to struggle with immersion. Not just to ask the question, who should be baptized, but how should the baptism be carried out? And this is, at least for me, it's a fascinating discussion. In 1640, now we're back to the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church, okay? We've got two others at this point. We've got the 1633 separation, and then we've got John Spilsbury's early Particular Baptist Church. But let's go back to Jacob Lathrop Jesse. In 1640, this church that already twice has faced separations over the question of baptism, again the subject arrives and it begins to be discussed among the people. About a year passed with a great deal of discussion and scripture searching, and finally one of the men was sent to Holland to observe the practice of immersion by a Dutch collegiate group called the Rijnsburgers. And in 1642, he returned, and baptism by immersion was enacted with about 53 people being baptized in the first month of the year. That's January 1642. I've been in London in January. It's cold. And yet they went down to the Thames, actually a tributary of the Thames, and 53 people were baptized. Now, this story is recorded for us in a manuscript that's known as the Kiffin manuscript, named after William Kiffin. The original apparently no longer exists, but a copy from the early 18th century, most likely transcribed by Benjamin Stinton, a pastor in London, exists in the Angus Library of Regent's Park College in Oxford. And it's thought that Stinton received the original from Richard Adams, a Particular Baptist minister from the second half of the 17th century, who had been an associate of William Kiffin in the Devonshire Square Church in London. Kiffin was part of the original group. Adams was his co-pastor for a while. Adams seems to have passed on his manuscript to Stinton. Stinton made a copy, and thus we have access to this by that procedure. It details the events that took place in the Jacob Lathrop Jesse Church, which led to one group's adoption of Baptist practices. I want to read to you a transcript of some portions of the Kiffin manuscript that are relevant. 1640, the third month, says this: "The church became two by mutual consent, just half being with Mr. P. Barebone." You ever hear his full name? Praise God, Barebones? I always wonder, what were his parents thinking? When he's 3 years old and he was naughty. Praise God, stop it. Doesn't work, does it? But that was his name. Praise God, Barebone. And the other half with Mr. Henry Jesse, Mr. Richard Blunt with him being convinced of baptism, that also it ought to be by dipping ye body into ye water, resembling burial and rising again, Colossians 2:12, Romans 6:4. Had sober conference about it in ye church, and them with some of the forenamed were also so convinced. And after prayer and conference about their so enjoying it, now let me talk about this conference. This is an interesting action on their part. It seems to me that what they did was that they met probably weekly, and it would have been the men in the church, who came together to discuss this practice, this possibility, for about a year. I can imagine them coming together with their Bibles, opening them, and ransacking the pages of Scripture to determine what does the Bible say about baptism. So they didn't quickly jump into this practice. Rather, they studied it for a long period of time and came to the conclusion that they ought to go forward. Now, they recognized, the manuscript goes on, it says, "None having then so practiced in England to professed believers." That is, no one was practicing baptism by immersion at that time. So they had no examples to follow in England. And hearing that some in the Netherlands had so practiced, they agreed and sent over Mr. Richard Blunt, who understood Dutch, with letters of commendation, who was kindly accepted there, and returned with letters from them, John Batt, a teacher there, and from that church to such as sent him. 1641. They proceed on therein, namely, those persons that were persuaded baptism should be by dipping ye body had met in two companies, and did intend so to meet after this. All these agreed to proceed alike together, and then manifesting, not by any formal words, a covenant, which word was scrupled by some of them, but by mutual desires and agreement, each testified, So they spoke to each other about their profession of faith. These two companies did set apart one to baptize the rest, so it was solemnly performed by them. Mr. Blunt baptized Mr. Blacklock, that was a teacher among them, and Mr. Blunt being baptized, he and Mr. Blacklock baptized the rest of their friends that were so minded, and many being added to them, they increased much. Now, this is what seems to have happened. They came to this conclusion that they needed to practice baptism by immersion, and so they came together, and there were two who became the leaders of the group. Mr. Blunt baptized Blacklock. Now, Blunt at this point is unbaptized. He baptizes Blacklock, and then Blacklock baptizes Blunt, and then they baptize the rest of those who come together. And there follows a list of 41 names, apparently of those who participated in this baptism. Now, according to the old calendar, the Julian calendar that was still used in England, the third month would have been May 1640. Now, you think the third month is March, but New Year's Day was March 25th. And so the third month from March would be May. You ever notice how at the end of our year, we have, well, the next month coming up is September. Now, we think of that as the 9th month, but sept is a prefix that says 7. October is 8. November is 9. December is 10. You ever notice that? And yet December is the 12th month. Well, if you count from March 25th, December is the 10th month, and that's why the names of the months are as they are. England didn't change it to the Gregorian calendar until the middle of the 18th century. And so you have these dates that sometimes are confusing to us. The baptisms are said to have taken place the 11th month, January. February would have been the 12th month, which seems to be January 1641 or 42, because, well, no, it's too complicated. Among those listed are three names who are also affixed to the 1644 confession: Thomas Kilcop, Thomas Munden, and Thomas Shepherd. Now, that helps us to understand the beginning of the practice of immersion among the particular Baptists. The General Baptists, the Arminian Baptists, weren't practicing it either at that point, although in 1642, in the same year, one of their leaders publishes a book called A Treatise of Dippings, and it seems that they watched what the particulars were doing and they carried on the practice as well. Now, skipping over some of this material, I want to talk about the opposition that they faced when they appeared in London. There were several men who seemed to have been self-appointed heresy hunters and who wrote about the 1644 London Confession as it was published by the Baptists. Maybe I should say the Confession of Faith saw the light of day in response to a demand that came from Parliament and the Westminster Assembly that these new churches would declare openly their beliefs. And so they quickly put together the first London Confession. It appeared, but there were watchers, and the watchers read it, and then they made some comments. And there are a couple that I want to mention here. The first is a man named Thomas Edwards. In 1646, he published a remarkable work, an amazing work, that he called Gangrena. So his nickname is Gangrena Edwards. I always wanted that to be my nickname, right? Gangrena, or a catalog and discovery of many of the errors, heresies, blasphemies, and pernicious practices of the sectaries of this time, vented and acted in England in these last 4 years. Now, I said it's an amazing piece of work. He took every scrap of gossip that he could find anywhere about anyone that he disagreed with and put it together to make this book. And so there's all kinds of information that simply isn't true, and yet because it was provided to him, he put it on. He's like a blogger who takes everything that he can get. He wants to go after someone, so he takes everything. Maybe he makes it up, and he puts it on the internet. If it's on the internet, it has to be true, right? If it's in Gangrena, it has to be true. In some ways, that's what this seems to be. In that work, Gangrena, Edwards mentions the 1644 confession, but interestingly, he doesn't find any fault with it. He admits that its statements are like those of, I quote, the Reformed churches. Now, he's not calling the particular Baptist a Reformed church, but he's saying that their doctrine is like that of the Reformed churches. But, he says, its fraud and fallaciousness because it's intended to conceal whatever he thought was the real truth of the Baptist doctrines. At least the confession was orthodox, but it didn't really tell what they believed. That's how he viewed it. Stephen Marshall, who was a member of the Westminster Assembly, attacked the Baptists in 1645. And John Toombs, the great anti-Pedo-Baptist, replied to him by pointing to the confession as a means of establishing the orthodoxy of the particular Baptists. Now, even more interesting than Featley are the comments, of Edwards, are the comments of Daniel Featley. Dr. Featley was briefly a member of the Westminster Assembly and a self-appointed heresy hunter. Here's what he says about the First London Confession. If we give credit to this confession and the preface thereof, those among us who are branded with that title, that is, Anabaptists, are neither heretics nor schismatics, but tender-hearted Christians, upon whom, through false suggestions, the hand of authority fell heavy whilst the hierarchy stood, for they neither teach free will, nor falling away from grace with the Arminians, nor deny original sin with the Pelagians, nor disclaim magistracy with the Jesuits, nor maintain plurality of wives with the polygamists, nor community of goods with the apostoliki, nor going naked with the Adamites, much less aver the mortality of the soul with the Epicures and the Psychopanicists, that means those who hold of soul sleep. And to this purpose, they have published this confession of faith, subscribed by 16 persons in the name of 7 churches in London. Now, these words are very interesting. Featley understood exactly what the Baptists intended in the publication of their confession, an honest demonstration of what they believed. Of course, Featley didn't receive it. He said this, "They cover a little ratsbane in a great quantity of sugar, that it may not be discerned. For among the 53 articles of their confession, there are not above 6, but may pass with a fair construction, and in those 6, none of the foulest and most odious positions wherewith that sect is aspersed are expressed." Okay, so you know what he means. There's ratsbane that's hidden with a lot of sugar. The sugar looks good, but there's poison there. And so he begins to tell us what the poison is, or how he perceives it to be in these 6 specific criticisms. Number 1, that the Baptists in Article 31 seem to imply that the right to earthly possessions is founded in grace, not in nature. Number 2, that Article 38 speaks against the support of ministers by the state. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th objections all deal with baptism, believers' baptism, because they reject infant baptism. And his 6th objection is that the Baptists allowed non-ordained men to preach. And that's the sum total of Featley's criticism. Now, what's really interesting here is what the Baptists did in response to Featley. They actually revised their confession, published a 2nd edition in 1646, and they revised all of the articles that Featley criticized, even the articles on baptism. So that Article 31, they acknowledge, was badly stated. They add a statement that says, "Outward and temporal things are lawfully enjoyed by a civil right by them who have no faith." They had misspoken. Article 38, they dropped the language against state support of ministers. Are you surprised by that? They dropped it out of the confession. They even slightly altered the language on baptism to head off some of his carping. In fact, the 2nd edition of the confession, the one that's more commonly available to us today, is a revised version in reply, at least partly, to the strictures of Daniel Featley. The Baptists toned down or altered some of their language so that it would be more acceptable to the Pedo-Baptists around them. Now, someone says, "They're a bunch of compromisers." I say, no, they're not at all. They were simply carrying out their original purpose. They wanted these men, these onlookers, to acknowledge their orthodoxy, and they understood that the only way to do this successfully was to reconsider some of their expressions. And we must always remember this. The First London Confession of 1644 was an attempt to remove the threat of persecution and gain theological acceptance from Pedo-Baptists, and the 2nd edition of 1646 was even more so. It served its purpose well, even if some thought, some like Edwards and Featley, that it was smokescreen for more nefarious doctrines. But it was an attempt to place these churches into the mainstream of Puritan theology in mid-17th century England. Now, there's a famous incident that took place immediately afterwards, and this is the incident at the Houses of Parliament in the Westminster Assembly. In January of 1646, Benjamin Cox and Samuel Richardson, two of the leaders of the Baptistic group, attempted to distribute copies of the First London Confession at the door of Parliament. And they were arrested. Here's the note from the House of Commons Journal. This is the official record. Thursday, 29 January 1646, resolved, etc., that the sergeant do apprehend Benjamin Cox and Samuel Richardson, the parties that delivered a pamphlet at the door to the members of this house entitled A Confession of Faith of 7 Congregations or Churches of Christ in London, which are commonly but unjustly called Anabaptists, and do take bail of them to appear from time to time at the Committee for Plundered Ministers. And that it be referred to the Committee of Plundered Ministers to examine the book and the parties whose names are subscribed, to send for the licensor and printer, and state the business to the House with all speed, and that the Committee of Plundered Ministers shall have power to advise with such of the assembly of divines as they shall think fit to send for upon this business. Ordered, etc., that the masters and wardens of the Company of Stationers do forthwith take diligent care to suppress a pamphlet entitled A Confession of Faith of 7 Congregations or Churches of Christ in London, and are commonly but unjustly called Anabaptists. Ordered that the sergeant-at-arms do immediately send some of his servants to seize and suppress the said books. Samuel Richardson and Benjamin Cox were accordingly called in, and being demanded who printed the pamphlet, said, one Simons, and that he got it licensed. And Richardson said that the printer told him that Mr. Downham licensed it, that this was a second edition, that they had meetings every first day of the week, that there were 7 congregations of them English and 1 French, and that the subscribers were 2 of every congregation. Well, that's an interesting and fascinating account, isn't it? Some of the members of Parliament were not in favor of what was going on, even though they had originally demanded that the Baptists give a fair account of their beliefs. There's so many things that we could speak of. The spread of Credo Baptist principles came even to some important politicians, a man named Henry Lawrence, who was part of Cromwell's governing coalition, or Colonel John Hutchinson. If you ever get a chance, read his biography as written by his wife, Lucy Hutchinson, an amazing woman who became a member of Owen's Church, but who was advocating for Credo Baptist principles. We might talk about the participation of early Particular Baptists in parliamentary discussions, such as the effort to allow Jewish people to return to England, church planting efforts, such as the Broken Wharf Church sending Thomas Tillam to the north with the support of Parliament, or William Kiffin's participation in the New England Company formed in 1649 by Parliament to reach Native Americans. See, what happened was things changed. And as things changed, the Baptists became much more palatable to the broader Puritan culture and to Parliament. And so the threat of persecution was taken away after these men were arrested, and greater attempts or efforts were made. Now, how did they view themselves? I want to read to you what I think is a fascinating piece of literature. Bristol was the second city in England, and in Bristol there were 4 dissenting churches, or 4 churches outside the Church of England. There was a Presbyterian congregation, a Congregational church, and 2 Particular Baptist churches. And in one of them, known to us from its meeting place in Broadmead, so Broadmead, Bristol, an elder, Edward Terrell, wrote down a history of the church. It's fascinating to read. I skimmed over it again this morning because I wanted to turn to his brief description of how the church came into being. He cites William Ames, for example, how William Ames in his work Cases of Consciences says that it's not a heresy to deny infant baptism. To Terrell, that was an important point to make by someone who was a secretary at the Synod of Dort and a well-respected Puritan. But after he lays out in great detail the history of his church, this is how he summarizes it. And he does so in 12 steps. This is not a 12-step program, but rather it is 12 steps that Terrell recognized for the beginning or the founding of his own church. He says this: "First of all, the Lord alone, by his Spirit, not by might nor by power, opened their eyes." These are Christians in the parish church in Bristol. "Opened their eyes and made them cast off the body of false doctrines of the Church of Rome, that had so long deceived the nations and made them drunk with the wine of her fornication, worshiping under pretense the true God in a false manner, wresting the Holy Scriptures to their own damnation, saying the real presence of Christ was in the sacrament that signified his body by a transubstantiation, and teaching that man's works merit salvation and works of supererogation, etc. Secondly, the Lord put into the hearts of some in authority in this nation to cast off the body of worship of Rome, as well as their doctrine, namely the nest of idolaters, even to cast out the monks, friars, abbots, priests, masses, advocation of saints, with praying for the deceased." And then the next sentence has a really wonderful little play on words I'll have to explain to you. "These were done long before, for which rough work God chose and fitted rough spirits to do it." Now, you can't see the fact that those first two roughs are spelled differently. They're homophones, but they're not homonyms. So rough and rough. The first one spelled R-U-F-F. It's an old word meaning vainglorious. Think about a ruffle. Have you seen pictures from the 16th and 17th century where the wealthy have a big white ruffle around their necks? Well, that's the derivation of this word. So vainglorious, for which God chose and fitted vainglorious spirits, and for which rough work, difficult work that requires a good deal of fighting and overcoming enemies, for which vainglorious and rough work God chose and fitted rough spirits to do it, more for their own interest and concern than aiming at God's glory. So through man's own private ends, the wise Lord managed his own good pleasure, witness King Henry VIII. So he's starting out with the Reformation on the continent. Now he's bringing it down to England through Henry VIII. Thirdly, it pleased the Lord in these latter days to raise up a people and make them come a step further in this Reformation, even to come from under the skirts of the whore and to cast off popish scraps of doctrine and worship, the appendices thereof, namely idolatrous holy days, primarily their three great or cardinal masses, namely Michael's Mass, Christ or Pie Mass, that's Christmas. Thirdly, Candlemas, days of their own invention like Jeroboam, together with a multitude of their saints' days, so-called, as St. All Souls and St. Midsummer, the folly of which might be shown at large if it might not obstruct the design of a brief narrative how the Lord brought this church out of darkness. You know, I read this and I think he's pulling the reins in on this because he really wants to go for it, but he's holding it in because he's summarizing. Fourthly, the Lord alone by his Spirit made them to disrelish and cast off carnal, debauched preachers, idle shepherds that cared not after the flock but the fleece, looking their gain from every quarter, that did not relish or savor what they preach, nor preach what they savored, being thus blind, others' eyes were opened not to follow them. Fifthly, the Lord made them to embrace and adhere, to love, follow, and cleave to lively and powerful preachers. By giving the people a taste of his Spirit, they desired more that they might grow thereby and could not be content with the abominable broth that was not poured out by his Spirit. Sixthly, the Holy One, by pouring forth into the hearts of those that should be saved a more sanctified spirit, he made them cast off and leave the common road. They forsook profaning the Lord's day and hearkening unto homilies, of which they grew weary. Now, he's already explained this in detail, how they stopped attending the parish church or listening to the homilies, which were simply prescribed sermons that had been written and published in the Book of Common Prayer. Seventhly, they left off superstitious bowing at the name of Jesus and to the altar, which thing was plain and open idolatry, worshiping and adoring that which there is no show of precept for, but a direct and visible breach of the second commandment, regular principle of worship. Eighthly, they cast off the cross and other ceremonies at their sprinkling children. Now, this is where he starts to preach, which was a good step, though the people could not see through to reform in that particular, to cast off the thing of sprinkling itself, which was the mere invention of men 300 years after Christ, being not mentioned of in Tertullian's time, the fruit of the apostasy that the church fell into from one thing to another, until at last they lost the substance of religion and kept only a shadow thereof. From From baptizing souls as they entered into the church in a river, they made a font and placed it in their public places near some great door, in all such places signifying or resembling the entrance into the church. Secondly, from dipping the children in the font, then by degrees took up sprinkling them. Thirdly, from a font in process of time, they used a basin in their place called a church. Fourthly, from a basin in their church, they brought it to a basin in the house. Fifthly, from men, their parsons, to sprinkle, they allowed women to do it in case of necessity, as they called it, to seal their wills and seal that which they never read by the party's profession or confession or saw by their conversation, thus leaving the examples in Holy Scripture and the commands of the Lord. In vain do they worship him, teaching for doctrines of the commandments of men, Mark 7:7, or traditions of men, setting up their posts by the Lords. Do you get a sense that this guy's a Baptist? Ninthly, though the Lord for a time winked at the times of these ignorances in that thing, he made them cast off the use of pictures and images, and they could not bear to hear any preach or plead for that old scrap and relic of idolatry, so much like pleading for Baal. Tenthly, the Lord so wrought upon their spirits that they would not kneel at the sacrament, because the example in Holy Scripture was sitting at the Lord's Supper. Although it was pleaded against them that so solemn an ordinance was to be done with a great deal of reverence, and kneeling was a reverence to God. But a reverence and decency that God hath not commanded must not be observed. To make void the example or command, the pattern must be kept. Remember, God's altar must not be made of hewn stone, which to men was more decent, so that this small thing in the eye of many was great strength to the godly that left it off. They that make conscience in doing small things will be made thereby stronger, and enabled to do greater. For he that hath clean hands shall wax stronger and stronger in the Lord. 11thly, they cast off hearing the common prayer, the nurse of formality and chain of security. Many persons, by reading thereof, without searching their hearts and leaving off sin, they would lick themselves whole in their thoughts or esteem, like the harlot in the Proverbs, who said, I have paid my vows, come let us sin and be vain, not regarding whether their spirits received any divine impress upon them, broken and humbled in the presence of God. And so the Spirit of the Lord was quenched, and no room to breathe from the sense of their present miscarriages or wants, whether consolation or humiliation. 12thly, they were helped by the Lord to cast off this also, and to step this further in their reformation, that at last they would not hear those men that did read common prayer, that did thereby declare themselves to own or partake in any part, consentingly to the worship of the beast. Then he says, thus I have briefly recited 12 steps that doth complete a demonstration that they, this church in their beginning, were truly reformed in a great measure in turning from the worship of Antichrist. And it is prayed and hoped that the Lord will in his due time not only turn them from Antichrist, but that he will also turn them perfectly to himself and make them so to wait upon him until he come. Revelation 2:25 and 22:20. Now, when he says we're truly reformed, he doesn't mean that they became a reformed church according to the tradition of the continental churches. He means that Reformation came all the way through their church. But isn't that a fascinating description? He starts with the global Reformation that took place under Calvin and Luther. He brings it to England through Henry VIII, and then he walks through the steps by which ultimately his church was formed in Bristol. He viewed his congregation as a part of the larger Reformation movement. He would have rejoiced in these 5 terms that we see above us, because that's what he was committed to. All right, in the time that remains to me, I do want to come across the Atlantic Ocean and talk a little bit about America in the 1640s and 50s. We have to start with Rhode Island, because Rhode Island is the nursery of the Baptists in America. Yesterday I spoke briefly, I mentioned Roger Williams, probably born around 1603, died in 1684, was brilliant and controversial. He was a defender of religious liberty. He was advanced in his day because he advocated for the rights of the Native Americans. He started out as an Anglican. When he came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1631, he joined the church in Salem, which was a separatist church, a very strongly separatist church. And by 1639, he had come to the belief that believers' baptism ought to be practiced. But he only held that view for about 4 months. And he became what's known as a seeker. Now, a seeker is one who is seeking for the true church. The seekers believed that the ministry of the church, the sacraments, the preaching of the word, the ordination of ministers was lost during the apostasy of Rome. It was so complete and so thorough that nothing remained, and thus nothing could be practiced until there was a new day of Pentecost and new apostles who would be sent by God for the restoring of these things that were missing from the church. So he was Baptist for about 4 months, but then he became a seeker. But he founded the First Baptist Church in Providence in Rhode Island in 1639. Now, he made some important contributions to early American history. Some have called him the forgotten founder. He preached to the Indians and he traded with them. He treated them as humans. He published a work called A Key to the Languages in America that was all about Native American languages, culture, and life. He showed respect to these people upon whose land he was living. In fact, he paid them for the land that became the town of Providence, Rhode Island. In 1644, he was involved in a controversy with John Cotton. And the controversy was over the fact that Williams and others had been driven out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Cotton was a participant in that. So he published a book called The Bloody Tenant of Persecution, in which he laid out the things that had been done to him and to others. Cotton replied in 1647 with a book called The Bloody Tenant Washed and Made White in the Blood of the Lamb. And in 1652, Williams replied with The Bloody Tenant Yet More Bloody. Now, there's a lapse of 8 years between the first and the third book. The reason is they had to send these manuscripts all the way back to London to get printed. There were no printing presses in the New World yet. Cotton, I'm quoting here, Cotton said that limited religious freedom could be allowed on incidental questions, but not on the more fundamental ones. The church and magistrates had a duty to see that the basic doctrines of true Christianity were accepted, even if they had to resort to force. He also argued that Williams was not persecuted for religious conscience, but for sinning against that conscience after he had been instructed in the truth. So we told you what you ought to believe, and you don't believe it, so we're going to persecute you on that practice. I said lots of good things about Cotton yesterday. Here's a dark spot on his record. There's one or two others as well. But that doesn't diminish the value of many of the things that he published. Williams advocated for the separation of church and state. And he argued that there's a fundamental difference between the two. One is civil, the state, the other is religious. And the magistrate was only to enforce the second table of the law, love your neighbor as yourself, not the four principles of the first table of the law. He believed in political democracy. So, Providence Plantations. Did you know that Rhode Island has the longest state name in the United States? It's the state of Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations is its official name. And so Providence Plantations was governed by majority vote of the citizens. Everybody had a role to play. It's still the common practice in most of the towns in New England. Now, there was another church nearby in Newport, not very far away. It's the Second Baptist Church formed in the New World. And there's a very important story to be told about the Newport Church. It had 3 elders. Their names were John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, and John Crandall. And interestingly enough, my wife is a direct descendant of John Crandall. Her grandfather was Mr. Roby Crandall. Her mother was born a Crandall. So this is her family story. This is the story of my kids, too, not mine. All my grandparents were immigrants, but all my kids participate in this story. They formed a church in Newport, Rhode Island in 1644. And in 1651, they went up to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Clark, Holmes, and Crandall, to visit one of their members, an old blind member of the church. His name was William Witter. On the Lord's Day, rather than attending the public worship in the Congregational Church, they held a service in Witter's home. They were ratted out to the authorities. They were raided, and they were arrested while they were preaching. Clark was fined 20 pounds. Crandall was fined 5 pounds, and both of their fines were paid. But Holmes was fined 30 pounds. It may be that he was the preacher. He refused to pay, and so he was publicly whipped across from the old State House in Boston. And this incident had wide publicity, and it elicited sympathy from many. In fact, Clark wrote a famous book. If you read any history of colonial Baptists, this will be told, the story and this book will be mentioned in whatever you read. The book was called Ill News from New England. And the subtitle was, Wherein While Old England Has Become New. Now this is the 1650s, Cromwell's in power, toleration is being spread. While old England has become new, New England has become old. Because New England now is a place where others, dissenters in a sense, were being persecuted. And in that work, interestingly enough, John Clark appealed to John Spilsbury and William Kiffin for assistance. Well, let's stay in Boston. Yesterday, Doug mentioned the first president of Harvard College. His name is Henry Dunster. Henry Dunster was observant of the events that took place, especially when Holmes was publicly whipped. And he went back to his Bible and he began to study, and we're told in 1653, the next year, this is the language that was used, he gave public expression of anti-pedobaptism. And in October 1654, now that's the autumn of 1654, he was the first president of Harvard. He had built a manse for himself. He had a young family. In October of 1654, he was forced to resign from Harvard and leave the home that he had built. He was sent out into the wilderness, in a sense, on his own, the hard-heartedness of the authorities, the powers that be. He went to Plymouth, and he lived for 5 more years. He died February 27th, 1659. But he was an anti-pedo Baptist. He didn't accept the principles of infant baptism any longer, and he was forced out of his position as a result. He had a friend. The friend's name was Thomas Gould. And Gould lived in Charlestown. Maybe some of you remember when we were in Boston in April. Charlestown is where Old Ironsides is birthed. It's right next to Boston and right next to Cambridge. He was a well-to-do man in the community. In 1655, he was placed under admonition from the Congregational Church in Charlestown because he refused to present his newborn infant child for baptism. He was influenced by Dunster. He was under discipline, under this censure for 10 years, and finally he was excluded on July the 30th, 1665. Now why then? Well, because in June of 1665, the previous month, the First Baptist Church of Boston was formed. So when the new church was brought into existence, the Congregational Church in Charlestown placed Gould under excommunication or exclusion. There were 9 original members of First Baptist Boston, 7 men and 2 women. When you look at the roster of members, it's interesting that most of them had ties to England. Richard Goodall was a member of William Kiffin's church in London, and he had a letter of dismission from them. William Turner and Robert Lambert had been members of Robert Steed's church in Dartmouth in England. And it's very important to notice the ties to England because the original Baptists of America considered themselves as one with the English particular Baptists. They faced tremendous opposition and persecution, and they didn't really have any freedom until 1714. They struggled with the opposition that came from the powers that be. If we go north a few miles to Kittery, Maine, there was a Baptist church that was planted there in 1681. It was led by a man named William Scriven, who was from one of Thomas Collier's churches in the west of England. And interestingly enough, after a while, living in Kittery, Maine, they determined that they wanted a better place for agriculture, and so the church moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and became the First Baptist Church of Charleston. But its roots are in Maine. Likewise, right near Cape Cod, in Swansea or Rehoboth, Massachusetts, a man named John Miles planted a church. This was another case of a church moving from Wales all the way across the Atlantic to the New World and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's an interesting story about this church in Wales. In 1644, a church in London, the Glasshouse Church in London, was having a day of prayer and fasting, believing that they wanted to see the gospel go forth and churches being planted. And that very day, 2 men knocked on the door where the church was meeting from Wales, because they wanted help in planting a church in Wales. In God's providence, it's very interesting, isn't it? Well, the Glasshouse Church in London took up the cause, and they helped them to form a church in Wales. By 1662, there were 5 churches in Wales. They formed an association, and then one of them, under John Miles' leadership, during this period of persecution, moved the entire church to Swansea in Massachusetts. Now, what's the point of all of this? Well, the point of it is to say, I think, number one, it's a fascinating history that we have. And number two, it's a great encouragement to think about how these men persecuted, not just men and women, persevered in the face of persecution that was brought upon them. In the opposition of Featley and Edwards to the Confession of Faith, in the arrest of Cox and Richardson by the powers that be in the Houses of Parliament, by the opposition that came as laid out in Edward Terrell's 12 Steps, here in the New World, by their commitments to the things of God. This is what our history is. And I think we can thank God and we can rejoice in it. They were humble, they sought to honor Christ, and they were willing to endure suffering and difficulty because of that commitment that they had to the Savior. Well, thanks for listening. I hope that that's an encouragement and helpful to you. God bless you.